Yo everyone, we've got a massive card to look forward to this weekend. UFC 313, Pereira vs Ankalaev takes place in a few days, and this card is absolutely stacked. Solid fights from top to bottom, and I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say I can't wait for that main event. I just want to say before I get into my predictions and breakdown for this card is that I do hear everyone loud and clear in the comments of these videos talking about potentially adding my bets, underdog picks, my favorite picks, locks of the cards, and my personal parlays to my videos for you guys to tag along. So what I will be doing is posting an extra video later this week as sort of a betting guide, and I will go into all of those things in that video, so please look out for that, guys. Keep your notification bells on for my channel, and I just need some more time to calculate exactly how I want my bets to be and how I would like to make the video for you guys. If you do end up liking that video and want to see it on a regular basis for cards, let me know in the comments below of this video and show some support on that later upload as well, and I will do them for every pay-per-view. As always though, for UFC 313, I will be starting with the prelims and working my way all the way to the main event. Timestamps are in the description and the comment section below if you'd like to skip to any fight in particular. We're going to be starting with the first fight of the card, which is Djorden Santos versus Ozzy Diaz. I'm convinced the UFC hates this guy big time, guys. No joke. They've only given this guy, I'm talking about Ozzy Diaz by the way, they've only given this guy absolute killers to verse whenever he gets the chance at fighting in the UFC. He got a chance on the Contender Series, and in his first fight, it was against Joe Pyfer, and he ended up getting knocked out in that one. And then he wins a few fights in the LFA, comes back to the UFC to debut properly against Minyang Zhang, which is crazy since Zhang is on like an 11-fight win streak right now with all of them being finishes. And now they've matched him up against a relatively unknown fighter in Djorden Santos, but don't be mistaken, guys. This guy is really good on the feet, quite the talent, honestly, and I remember him specifically, if I remember correctly as well, in his last bout, it was against Will Curry on the Contender Series, and he was a massive underdog in that fight, and he was doing so well that he ended up showboating mid-round. That's how good this guy is on the feet, and that's the main reason I feel bad for Ozzy Diaz, just because the guy can't seem to catch a break or get an easy fight. I'm going to be locking in straight away Djorden Santos to win this fight, most likely by KO, but I might say KO or decision for a potential bet. He will get put into the confident picks list. He's just got a massive advantage in the stand-up. His footwork and boxing combinations are just so good when he puts it all together. He did a great job stuffing the takedown attempts as well and scrambling against Will Curry in his last fight, which just ends up giving me more confidence in his ability to keep this one standing and do well in the clinch in this fight. So that's my pick. Moving on to the next fight, which is Chris Gutierrez versus John Castaneda. Now, this fight was thrown together at super late notice because I remember John Castaneda was meant to fight against Douglas Silva de Andrade on the last card. I did pick him to beat Douglas Silva de Andrade as well. And if I'm not mistaken, that concerns me in regards to picking John Castaneda just because the fight was relatively close and it was only called off a couple days before. So I'm sure he would have started the weight cut and everything like that, and now he's had to redo a whole weight cut and basically do 2 weight cuts in the span of a week and a half. It isn't everything in regards to picking someone, but it is something important to know. And I also do think that Chris Gutierrez is just overall the more solid and technical striker of the two. He reminds me a bit of like Jonathan Martinez since he wears those ankle socks, and he tends to throw quite a few leg kicks in his fights. John Castaneda is a solid striker, well-rounded fighter as well. The guy does find some solid shots when you least expect it, and he's got some nice kicks himself as well. I just think that Gutierrez will get the better shots off in this fight, and I think he is the more technical of the two, like I mentioned earlier. On the feet, I think he just gets hit a lot less and is quite a bit better defensively than John Castaneda. John Castaneda does have some solid output, but he can be a little too reckless and tend to rely on his chin a bit in fights, and that can get him in trouble with someone like Chris Gutierrez. I also mentioned Chris Gutierrez was already prepping for a fight on this card, and he knew there was going to be a replacement for his opponent, or he knew there was going to be some sort of setup match for him on this date, so I think he is the better prepared fighter out of the two, and I do think sometimes, like I said earlier, that can make quite a bit of difference in some UFC fights. So Chris Gutierrez will be my pick for this fight. Moving on to Mairon Santos versus Francis Marshall. Now, this is another fight where the odds are quite skewed in the favor of a certain fighter, and this fighter, in this case, is Mairon Santos. And Mairon Santos is a solid striker. He's very good ability to counterpunch, as was seen in his last fight versus Khan Offley, where he was able to knock him out on the back foot with a vicious hook. The guy has pretty solid takedown defense as well, and just overall, he can be a bit hard to deal with on the feet just due to his great volume. He's got good footwork, solid power, and last but not least, his very versatile kicking game, especially his leg kicks. He is currently 14-1 with his only loss being to Dan Argueta outside the UFC, where he showed some struggling to get off bottom position before being finished in that fight. Francis Marshall is a decent striker, but he is definitely one to rely on his grappling a lot more. Very good grappler and wrestler with some solid power in his hands. He can get taken down himself though, which was shown in his KO loss to Isaac Dolgarian, where he was taken down early in the first round and finished with brutal ground and pound. He is coming off a split decision win over Dennis Bazooka, which ended up turning into a bit of a slugfest. Honestly though, I think Mairon has shown some solid improvement in his takedown defense. He's looked solid like in his fight against Khan Offley, and in my opinion, he's at least one league above of Francis Marshall in the stand-up department. I could see him being able to keep this fight on the feet whilst being able to piece up Francis Marshall with his striking advantage in the process. If Marshall closes the distance a little too recklessly, like I have seen him do in some other fights, he might end up giving the chance to Mairon Santos to get another TKO on his record. I'm going to go with Mairon Santos to get this one done by TKO or decision. I will be adding it to my confident picks list as well, because I do believe he will be able to neutralize the takedown attempts in this fight. Moving on to Alex Morono versus Carlos Leal. Now, this is a very interesting fight because I believe Carlos Leal was the guy who, in my mind, beat Rinat Fakhretdinov in a close fight, and I actually picked Rinat to win that fight, but watching it live, I thought he was gifted a robbery decision. It was a very impressive performance from Leal in that fight, showcased his durability, his takedown defense, his overall striking counters and power. The guy is an extremely solid fighter in the welterweight division, and the thing about this fight is, you never know what version of Alex Morono you're going to get, because sometimes the guy just looks really solid, he's just overall great on the feet, and then other times you wonder what he's doing inside the octagon. I watched his fight with Nico Price not too long ago, and couldn't believe what I was seeing with my own two eyeballs. I was pretty disappointed, and then he puts on a pretty solid performance against Daniel Rodriguez in his very next fight. He didn't win, but it was a very solid performance. The man is truly unpredictable. I think he might do well on the feet with his movement if he's able to keep it up for a full 3 rounds, but I just can't gamble a pick on Alex Morono when you can get an extremely solid reliability factor on a Carlos Leal pick here. I'll just finish this pick by saying as well, if Alex Morono comes out looking how he looked against Nico Price in this fight, he is getting finished 100%, no questions asked. But if he comes out looking similar to how he looked in his Daniel Rodriguez fight, I think there is a potential that this fight could end up being relatively close and need to go to the judges' scorecards. I will be going with Carlos Leal, but I do think the odds could be a little closer than like a -600 favorite on Carlos Leal, as I'm currently seeing them, man. Pretty steep odds. Moving on to Brunno Ferreira versus Armen Petrosyan. Extremely interesting fight on this card. I can see Brunno Ferreira is a slight underdog in this fight, and I have been picking Brunno Ferreira to win almost every single fight he's had in the UFC so far. Armen Petrosyan is good, and if he is good at one thing usually, it's being able to stay out of trouble in the striking and do solid work from the outside. He's coming off of back-to-back losses where he was submitted by Rodolfo Vieira, and then his most recent fight and loss being the double spinning back fist KO to Shara Magomedov, where he was actually doing quite well in that fight leading up to the finish. I think the two main things that happen here in this fight in particular though, is that I think that Armen manages to keep the distance well, he's able to avoid the big power shots of Ferreira, and he's able to coast to a close decision win over Brunno Ferreira. But on the other flip side of that coin, Brunno Ferreira probably gets that knockout victory over him. So that's how I see this fight ending the majority of the time for these two guys, and I do think this fight won't end up on the ground, similar to Armen Petrosyan's fight with Gregory Rodriguez, and also similar to Brunno Ferreira's fight with Abus Magomedov. I think this will be a purely stand-up fight, and we will just have to see how this ends up playing out, but Brunno Ferreira will be the one to throw less in this fight. Armen Petrosyan will fire way more often and be lighter on his feet in this fight, while Brunno Ferreira fires way less, and saves his energy for the blitzes and power punches. Both guys do lack defensively sometimes, and that does want to make me lean towards the guy with the stronger punch, because in exchanges that can make a big difference, and this is a hard one to decide, but I do like the idea of picking an underdog, and I do like Brunno Ferreira as well, so I will side with him to get this one done by TKO. Armen can get stationary sometimes and stay in the pocket in exchanges a little too long, and that may cost him in a fight against a heavy puncher like Brunno Ferreira. I'm going to trust in the power of Brunno Ferreira to get this one done. It's a very close fight. Probably not betting on this one outright because Armen Petrosyan has a very good chance to win this one. Moving on to Joshua Van versus Rei Tsuruya. Another great matchup. This card is full of great matchups. I would have been happy paying for this fight if it was on the main card of this pay-per-view. Extremely high-level young guys in the flyweight division. Joshua Van, the pressure-heavy boxer and cardio machine. He will not stop pushing forward, and the man does not slow down and tends to build up into his fights in the later rounds. Sometimes you might see him start off slow in the first round, but increase his pace significantly for the second and third rounds of fights. He does have some solid takedown defense as well to back that up, and that does really aid him to keep the fight where he wants it to be, which is on the feet. Rei Tsuruya is the complete opposite of Joshua Van. Little to no stand-up striking finesse, but is an absolute monster on the ground. For a 22-year-old dude in the flyweight division, he might have one of the best grappling and wrestling games I have seen in the UFC flyweight division currently, which says a lot since the only ones in front of him would be Pantoja and maybe Tatsuo Taira on pure talent alone. He is not just the type of guy to shoot for single legs. He will shoot doubles. He will clinch and try sweeps. He will take your back. He will judo throw, ankle pick, you name it. This kid tries it in fights. And honestly, if whoever's listening to this wants a sneak peek or preview into my betting guide that will be uploaded later this week, I'll say this right now. I think I'll be locking in Rei Tsuruya as my #1 underdog of this card. I think he's got a great chance to win, especially seeing how much success Cody Djorden had in his wrestling against Joshua Van in the first round of their fight. I think Rei Tsuruya will be able to get the takedowns against Joshua Van in this fight and be able to secure either the decision win or potentially get a finish by submission. And don't get me wrong, guys, I love Joshua Van. I think I've picked him to win every single fight he's been in inside the UFC so far in his career, and if Joshua Van manages to stuff all the takedown attempts and keep this one on the feet, there is no doubt in my mind he will be able to beat Rei Tsuruya, and honestly, most likely he will finish Rei Tsuruya by TKO as well, if that were the case. But I just believe Rei Tsuruya is good enough in the grappling department to get the win over Joshua Van in this fight. After seeing what he was able to do against a fantastic grappler and Carlos Hernandez in his last fight, I feel more confident than ever in his grappling ability. Locking in Rei Tsuruya to get this one done. Moving on to Curtis Blaydes versus Rizvan Kuniev. Now, I don't know about how you guys feel, but I don't even know how Kuniev got a direct shot off the Contender Series to fight Curtis Blaydes. I don't even know how he got into the UFC with the controversy surrounding him popping for steroids. I don't think I've seen something like this happen before. Maybe most recently it was like Kai Asakura versus Pantoja, with Asakura getting a title shot in his debut, but the guy had success outside the UFC and was already a massive name and a big draw. With Rizvan, it's basically him skipping the queue and getting a shot at the top 5 of the heavyweight division, being an unknown dude, which is crazy to me. Especially since in his last fight against Renan Ferreira in the PFL, it got overturned to a no contest because he tested positive for multiple steroids, 4 different banned substances after that fight. And this guy, you're allowing to skip the queue and fight one of the best heavyweights in the world. I'll never understand this shit, man. Regardless, though, I'm just gonna say it straight up. I hate picking UFC debuters regardless of controversy, regardless of anything, to win fights, and I don't think I'll be making an exception to the rule in this situation either. Rizvan is a solid striker. He's a decent wrestler. He's got decent power. I do think he could be somewhat decent inside the UFC as well, but this much of a step up in competition can sometimes just be too much for a fighter. Curtis Blaydes is a dangerous guy. He's very powerful, but one of the only strong wrestlers as well in the heavyweight division besides maybe the 2 champs and Jailton Almeida himself. So I can see Curtis Blaydes keeping this one on the feet and potentially getting a KO over Kuniev after being able to stuff a couple takedown attempts from him. The only thing that makes me worry a little for Curtis here is that he's a little ploddy and sometimes he just doesn't use his wrestling advantage right away, and both these things can get him in trouble with decent strikers, and Kuniev is really not bad on the feet. I think that a Rizvan Kuniev that is not on steroids and not being able to secure the takedown will struggle a lot against the Curtis Blaydes. So Curtis Blaydes is a little too good, in my opinion, in the wrestling and grappling to allow himself to struggle on the ground with Kuniev, and like I said, I don't think he will be able to even secure the takedown in the first place. But if it does end up on the ground, I just don't think he has much to worry about. Curtis Blaydes is the pick, but I am a bit wary about putting him in my confident picks list just because this is a heavyweight fight and anything can happen, but I am relatively comfortable in this pick. That's who I'm going to go with, most likely by TKO as well, maybe round 2 TKO if you want to get me to be a bit more specific. Let's move on to the main card, King Green versus Mauricio Ruffy. Man, I wish Bobby Green did not change his name to King Green, because it's his nickname anyway. Like, now we call you King Green? Is that meant to be how he's introduced in the octagon now, or does he just remove his fighter nickname forever because his actual name is King now? I don't know, and it doesn't matter too much anyway in regards to picking who's going to win here or not. Mauricio Ruffy, top up-and-coming prospect in the division, one of the 4 major fighters of the Fighting Nerds gym currently, fighting in the UFC, the others being Caio Borralho, Gene Silva, and Carlos Prates, of course. The guy is being compared to Conor McGregor because of his striking ability and his overall fluidity in his movements, his stance, and his style just being similar to Conor's. But he is his own fighter, since he can be quite tricky with takedowns as well, and does do decent on the ground too. We've all probably seen the scissor sweep highlights that the UFC always keeps showing us to hype up his fights. Mauricio Ruffy will be looking to make a statement here against Bobby Green by potentially knocking out Bobby Green in this matchup, or King Green, my mistake. King Green is very fluid, he has great footwork, and can be quite tricky on the feet to fight, especially if you're a bit more ploddy and a bit more one-dimensional in your footwork. The guy really will end up outclassing you when it comes to matchups like that, but unfortunately for him, this is probably one of the worst matchups for him relative to his style. Mauricio might be the faster of the two on the feet, he has the power advantage as well for sure, he's the more solid and technical sound striker from the fight tape I've watched, and he picks his shots incredibly well and is usually able to find that KO shot on his opponents. Bobby Green has been hurt plenty of times in the past, badly KO'd multiple times, finished by a lot of top strikers. It's hard to see him doing well against someone who will have the height and reach advantage going into this one, on top of having all the physical and technical attribute advantages in their favor too. This fight will be 100% a stand-up bout as far as I think as well, and I think Bobby Green will be doing his thing early, but I just see him being caught by a massive shot from Mauricio Ruffy in the first or second round of this fight and being put out bad again. Maybe not as bad as the Jalin Turner knockout, but still, I think he gets finished by Mauricio Ruffy early in this fight. And I was thinking about potentially putting a KO or decision bet on Ruffy, but depending on the odds, might just put a bet on KO straight up, since I really do see it happening. I'm really surprised that Mauricio Ruffy didn't knock out James Lontop in his most recent bout, but Lontop showcased an insane chin, and I don't think Green can take those sort of shots. So Mauricio Ruffy by KO, locking it in, adding him to my confident picks list as well. Moving on to Amanda Lemos versus Iasmin Lucindo. Not to talk smack about this fight, because I think it will be pretty decent, but I do think that Van versus Tsuruya or Blaydes versus Kuniev could have been on the main card, in my opinion, over this fight. But pushing that to the side, strawweight MMA fights, guys, in particular strawweight WMMA fights, guys, another time I'll bring this up, they go to decision on average 67% of the time. So if you place a solo bet on just one of these fights to go the distance, you cash that check on average almost 7 times out of 10, which is crazy to me. And I might look to do something with that, maybe parlay that with something else. But in regards to who I think wins this fight, I think Iasmin Lucindo is the slight favorite here, but the odds are relatively close. I'm going to cut to the chase and say that I personally think Amanda Lemos has the massive edge on the feet, in my opinion. I think if she keeps this one standing, she could very well get herself a very easy win here, honestly. I think the major worry for her is the grappling with Iasmin Lucindo. I understand that because Amanda Lemos has shown in her bouts with Weili Zhang, Mackenzie Dern, and Verna Jandiroba that she can be outgrappled and can be taken down and held down in her fights. But look at the names I just listed. Those are some of the best grapplers in the division, and I cannot compare Iasmin Lucindo to those ladies at this point in her career. She's very young, even in some of those bouts as well, mostly speaking about Mackenzie Dern and Virna Jandiroba fights. Amanda Lemos didn't do that terribly and was able to reverse positions and find her own success in the wrestling, especially in that Mackenzie Dern fight. I'm locking in Amanda Ribas to get this one done by decision. Moving on to the feature fight of the card, Jalin Turner versus Ignacio Bahamondes. This is a crazy matchup to me. The main reason that is because Jalin is insanely big for the lightweight division, and he's listed as being 6'3", and he looks massive every time he's in the octagon, and Bahamondes is the exact same height and reach as him, so they've just picked out pretty much the tallest dudes in the division for a scrap. So that's a funny fact for you guys there, but in all honesty, tricky fight to predict here. I'm probably going to stay away from this fight in terms of adding it to bets, just because it is so close. The odds are dead even as well, and I do agree with that. Both guys have pretty identical styles, rangy strikers with solid power, but both also have decent ground games, enough to where they can get some decent submissions in certain situations and positions. I will say this though, I think Ignacio might be the better mover. He's got the better footwork, and I also think he's the more durable out of the two and has the better chin to withstand some of the wilder exchanges in this fight. But on Jalin Turner's side, he will have the power advantage going into this one. I also think he will have the overwhelming experience advantage in terms of versing higher level competition for longer. I think he might also have the slight speed advantage in this fight as well, if you ask me. And if you ask me who I'm favoring to win in this one, I think this will be a close fight. Most likely it will go to decision as well. I do see Jalin Turner being able to do more damage in this fight than Ignacio Bahamondes. Both guys lack a little defensively in some spots, and I just can see the power advantage being able to make a bigger impact in this fight for Jalin Turner. Ignacio is a hot prospect coming off a very impressive win over another big prospect in Manuel Torres, but I do think this might end up being slightly too much of a jump up in experience. Not in terms of overall fight experience, just in terms of quality of their opponents. Jalin Turner is the pick. The dude's still only 29 years old, still looking relatively good in his fights, has had 2 close losses to Gamrot and Dan Hooker, and then ended up fumbling a bit of a win over Renato Moicano on UFC 300. He's not that bad. I think he has a good chance to win here. Moving on to the co-main event of the card, Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev. An extremely interesting matchup, like I've said for every fight on this card. Would have preferred the fresh matchup of Dan Hooker versus Justin Gaethje, but injuries happen and replacements also do happen. So now we do have a solid replacement in Rafael Fiziev. I know it's a rematch, but their first fight was relatively close. If you guys don't remember their first fight, Fiziev had a lot of success in the first and second rounds of that fight before Gaethje really started to find major success and pour on the damage in the third round of that fight. The thing is, when I watched the first fight live, I did end up edging it to Gaethje, but I could have seen a world where the judges gave the first 2 rounds to Fiziev, so I don't think this fight is just going to be entirely like that third round. Fiziev really is no joke. But to contradict myself here a little bit, as much as I do think Fiziev is extremely solid, and the fact that he was already chosen for this fight means that he will make the weight, meaning he should be relatively in good shape for it, there is a big difference between being in shape and being in 3-round war fight shape, needing to fight the pace of someone like Justin Gaethje. And for someone like Fiziev, whose fight style revolves around being extremely fast and explosive, I can only see him tiring out earlier in this fight than the last fight and potentially getting finished by late rounds TKO or losing a decision again. It's just how I see it going. I see a few people starting to pick Rafael Fiziev just because of that nasty KO loss that Gaethje took in the most recent loss he had at the hands of Max Holloway, but the world is too based on recency bias sometimes, and they don't look at the other side of the coin sometimes either. Rafael Fiziev has been out for around a year and a half after copping a really bad injury to his knee. I believe it was a torn ACL, and crap like that is no joke, especially when you have to return to the octagon, and your return is going to be against one of the best and hardest leg kickers in the sport's history. I don't know, guys. I can just see Fiziev slowing down early in this one after the first round wraps up, not pacing himself properly, and then, due to the accumulated damage to the legs, the body, the head, and his fatigue overall, Gaethje starts to pour on the damage even more with little resistance to get the late rounds TKO or decision win. That's my pick, guys, and I'm sticking to it. It's insane because I think Fiziev is actually the favorite right now over Gaethje, and I would 100% jump on a bet there in my opinion. That's the pick. Moving on to the main event of the evening, Alex Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev. Guys, this is a dead even fight, and I'm happy the odds show it. It's literally too hard to know how Alex Pereira will deal with the takedowns or the takedown threat of Magomed Ankalaev going into this fight, and how that will affect his striking. I checked the subscribers poll on who you guys think wins this matchup, and the majority of you are siding with Alex Pereira, and I will get to who I am picking in a little bit, but before I talk about that, like I mentioned, it is just too hard for me to know how Magomed Ankalaev will deal with the leg kicks and the counter left hook of Alex Pereira in the early rounds of this fight. And also, it's hard to know if Alex manages to keep this one on the feet, or if Magomed Ankalaev decides not to shoot any takedowns in the first couple rounds of this fight. I'm staying away from this fight in regards to betting on it. Maybe there could be something potentially for an inside the distance bet or for a finish, but I don't know. I'd stay away from this one fully personally. There's so many unknowns going into this one. Magomed Ankalaev is fighting during Ramadan, so I'm not sure how that might affect him going into this fight, since he usually abstains from fighting during that period. And he also stated publicly that he will not be taking down Alex Pereira in the first round, or I think in the first few rounds of the fight, and he will strike with him. So I don't know how true that will be, but I definitely don't agree with him doing that. I think that Magomed Ankalaev going into this fight, he's a predominant striker. The guy is 100% a predominant striker. The guy is a better striker than he is a grappler, and he does prefer striking in his fights. He doesn't use his wrestling very often, and even when he does, he rarely uses it early in fights, like he mentioned, more so starting to wrestle in the second, third, and fourth round of fights. I don't know why he does this when a lot of top guys struggle with more wrestling. The only thing I can think of is because, just like what I mentioned earlier, when describing him, he really does prefer striking over grappling, and he is a more talented striker than he is a grappler. He really struggled in the Jan Blachowicz fight because of this fact. He got his legs chewed up, absolutely destroyed for the first 3 rounds of that fight before deciding to implement more takedowns to wear down Jan in the later rounds of that fight and do solid ground and pound. I think Jan pretty much laid the framework down on how Alex Pereira can beat Magomed Ankalaev going into this one, and that is to stay defensively sound, stuff the takedown attempts, and be able to stay away from the cage clinching and constantly kick the legs of Magomed Ankalaev. I think if Alex Pereira has all of those things on point in this matchup, he will win this fight, and he will most likely win it by KO as well. I think Magomed has the chance to win this fight by KO as well, don't get me wrong, but more so if he implements his grappling in this fight to wear down Alex Pereira early on, to slow him down drastically before catching him or finishing him with ground and pound after a takedown. That's how I see both these guys winning this. I think going the distance is unlikely, but if it does, I might edge the chance of a decision win to Ankalaev just because he isn't afraid to constantly clinch fight against the cage, knee the thigh, win a boring fight if he feels like it's getting too dangerous. As a fan, I want Alex Pereira to win, but I don't think Magomed Ankalaev would be that boring as a champion either. At least not as boring as a lot of people say he will be. Alex is just the more exciting of the two. I will be leaning towards and locking in Alex Pereira to win this fight, most likely by KO as well. I believe if he's able to keep this one standing, stuff the takedowns well, strike with Magomed, he will be able to exploit the weaknesses in Magomed's striking defense, and he will open up a lot more to that left hook counter, similar to Jamal Hill and Yuri Prochazka, who were the other former opponents and victims of the left hook of Pereira. I keep seeing some interviews saying Pereira is a real black belt and he can use his skills, but I'll believe it when I see it, guys. Pereira by flying armbar, perhaps? Need to see the odds on that. But in all seriousness, Pereira is my pick in a very close fight, most likely by KO. That's it for my main event pick, guys, and that's it for my full card predictions and breakdown for UFC 313, Pereira vs. Ankalaev. If you guys have any thoughts or any questions for me regarding the card, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll do my best to respond to every single comment left in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and see you guys next time.